Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 488 of the podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. I'm just back from the New Clay Conference up in Ottawa and had a great time. I feel refreshed and rejuvenated after talking to so many folks. I'd like to thank Caitlin Brennan for putting together such a wonderful conference. It ran so smoothly, thanks largely to her efforts as well as the folks at the Gloucester Pottery School. We did record a live episode with the presenters as well as Carol Epp and Marianne Chenard from the Kiln Sitters. We're going to broadcast that on this podcast in about 2 or 3 weeks, so I'm looking forward to getting that out to you in the near future. Today on the show, I'm talking with Jonathan Christensen Caballero. His mixed media figure sculptures pay homage to Latino histories and the places he's lived. In this interview, we talk about his interest in local history, the practical aspects of making a living and showing large-scale figure sculpture, and his blend of fibers and ceramics. For more information, you can visit his website, that's jcc-sculpture.com. You can also follow him on Instagram at jccsculpture. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. Well, let's start talking about labor history, because that's something that I noticed that your pieces are informed by, but also local history. You're usually making work about specific local histories. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. The work that I make is very much informed by my own kind of background. So with my parents, they supported our family through labor jobs, namely my father being working at a job site mechanic for like large kind of industrial equipment like cranes and forklifts and such. And then my mother as a elementary school cafeteria manager. And that then kind of combined then with the fact that my mom is from Panama and half my family still reside in Panama. And so that kind of confluence of influence leads to then the work that I continue to research about. Most of the work started off with like this kind of personal narrative, trying to understand myself because I didn't really see my own history showcased or described in school in any kind of real way. And so since then, now it's like almost like a retroactive way of learning about some of these histories and learning about people who I feel like I have more in common with, as opposed to what is generally described in textbooks or in mass media. And so now, after having kind of focused more on the internal, kind of learning about my own life and thinking about work in that way, now since really moving from graduate school to then residencies, I started to then think about what is happening in the local area. How can I learn about the local Latino history and what that is, and then incorporate that into the work, just being as a person who's an outsider, not local to the area. I thought that it was more important to then highlight those histories instead.
Let's go back to your parents. You grew up in Utah, is that right?
I did.
Can you describe what the Latin American community was like in Utah?
Actually, Latinos are the largest majority or minority within Utah. So Utah itself is predominantly kind of Anglo-Saxon, Caucasian, and it has a strong Mormon population. And then outside of that, there's a lot of, as you move westward as well as you moving kind of further to the southwest, there's a lot more Latin Americans as well as then indigenous tribes. And so then from kind of that respect, it's predominantly Mexican. As you're westward, there's a lot more Mexican influence, and then also some Central American immigrants as well. And so I definitely, I grew up with people who, I'll be from Colombia, Peru, a couple other people who are also from Panama, and then, significantly though, people of Mexican origin.
I've noticed that a lot of times in your work you use fabric, and I think you describe that as being to pay homage to sewing, which is usually a female activity, and that you're paying homage to the labor, the act of sewing, but also just sewing within the Latin American community as a way of uplifting that practice. So can you tie that in, like your choice of materials and how that fits into this?
Yeah, my first real use of secondhand clothes and fiber was the fact that it was secondhand. So it really began in a place of trying to use the materials that I grew up with. I still wear hand-me-down clothes to this day, as well as then thinking about like what resources people had access to. And for a long time, it was kind of, to be honest, a chip on my shoulder. It was something that I wasn't proud of that I was wearing hand-me-down clothes. And it was something that was brought really, especially to my attention in graduate school in my very first private critique with my faculty, where Malcolm and Tim especially were just like, why are you not using clothes to talk about socioeconomic problems? It's like you're referencing these things and you're not using this material that is so much can speak to these things, speak to these problems, and like used as criticism of these practices as opposed to kind of stepping around these ideas. Just use the thing itself. And so I remember Malcolm actually challenging me to make a sculpture entirely at clothes, just to try. And I honestly wasn't ready for it. It took me an entire year of making as a student and still doing solely ceramic at that moment, until I was actually comfortable enough and learned some history of fibers and of clothes that then I felt like it was like I had to use it then. And it was after then the Human Figure Symposium I went to at Aramont in 2018, and also getting to work with Richard James as well and his work. And then it was like just a turning point where I realized, no, I have to use this and I have to include it. And then the sewing part is something that, funny enough, is my dad is Scandinavian background. My mom's from Panama. But the sewing is something that I actually relate more to my dad's side in that he had a sewing machine and he would use it to make things because he was very much a fabricator. And, you can't have, if you don't have money to buy it, you make it, and so I first actually used a sewing machine through my dad, and then kind of like forgot how to use it, didn't use it for many years. And then that very first sculptures I made, I hand stitched everything. And it was extremely labor intensive to make those life-size figures. And, being kind of ignorant to like just fibers basics, I was made the work so much harder on myself, just by not knowing, and luckily then it was actually Joey Quinones who was like, you should be using like a rotary cutter instead of scissors. You should be using a sewing machine instead of hand stitching everything, And it's just like basics, but it's just like, as you're like learning something new, you're just kind of moving through the dark a bit, And so that's really where then a lot more of the use of the sewing machine started to happen. And then now I'm, thinking more about then the embroidery that's on a lot of like traditional clothes throughout Latin America. And so I have one piece that is specifically a figure actually sewing, and it's because it's tying into some local oral history from Lawrence, where some of the people, the residents there, described using bread and potato sacks to then fabricate clothes for their kids. And this was, especially in the like 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, many people did that. And then, so like using and sewing with like what you have, finding a way to like provide for your family. And then like the embroidery that's happening on top, the kind of floral parts of it, it's just small, but just as a way to like create like some beauty and some adornment on something that, the material itself is quite humble origin.
Yeah, and I feel like that when you bring fiber, which is such a soft material beside clay, all of a sudden you start to get that textural difference, but also a major color shift. So fabric often has a saturated color, like you're not seeing the translucency. I guess you could have a sheer fabric, but a lot of what you're using is like layers of cut strips that are then, yeah, can you just describe like how you put the fabric back together after it's been cut apart?
So I work with a process where I'm like making the ceramic first, and then once it's through the kiln, I make either a combination of wood and metal armatures that then the ceramic components are attached to. Then from there, I cut up clothes. If it's a full figure, then I use a lot of like long sleeve sweaters and shirts and or pants to create these longer, almost like pillow like kind of blocks. In the same way that when you're building solid with clay, you add large pieces first, and then you kind of block in until you start to refine the form. And so it's a very similar process where I'm blocking in these large chunks, but then because they have this like pillow quality, they're very just like they speak too much to the softness of the clothing in a way that doesn't really articulate the body in a way that I like. And so then from there, once I get it rough kind of blocked in, then I cut the shirts and sweaters and pants, all secondhand from Goodwill, into strips, and then bind around then those kind of pillow-like forms and tighten everything so it becomes much more rigid. And then that's where it's really more like articulating the body itself. And I really think about how the clothing itself, which on our bodies is such like a superficial thing. It's like literally millimeters thick, but it has so much about defining ourselves to other people, what resources we have, what things we hold dear to us, cultural elements. And so then it becomes the bodies themselves, it becomes the people. And so I think about all that tension that I'm creating within it, that is both the tension of like the muscles from the labors, but also then the tension within that tension, just like rope, creates strength. And so it's kind of this push and pull of like the effects of these labors, as well as then like the body's being able to withstand that and grow strong in relationship to it.
Yeah, and it's a great symbol of labor, as you mentioned, because there's something about it. It almost seems ritualistic, like that the binding, the wrapping. I also think about just generally wrapping in terms of like old practices of mummification. It's like this is special. We're going to protect this, and I don't necessarily get that when I look at a T-shirt, but I do get that when I look at the way that you sort of construct the fabric around the form.
Yeah. And the way I use fiber, in many ways, it really is coming from, like, as I said, like I'm a total fiber baby. I don't have like proper training in fibers. I'm finding my way through this material. And for then that reason, I've gravitated for all my time towards figurative work that has like a very gestural quality to it. But I can't bring my own hands to create that. It's very contrived and it doesn't come out of me naturally. And so by using a material that I'm like really untrained with in comparison to my peers who work within fibers, like it is like this act of letting it be textural, letting it be very obvious that it is a shirt, that it is like where its origin is, even though it's been transformed to become something else.
You mentioned Joey Quinones that you've learned from them, and I love their work. They were on the show, I don't know, half a year ago, and some of the work, their grad school work, just amazing. And it is a refined sense. I mean, they're really good at fibers. Like, actually, they're kind of really good at everything. So, just that skill of sewing, every fabric has a meaning. There's this layering of meaning in the way that they work that I really appreciate. And I think that's also something that figure sculptors in general, like Richard James does the same. You mentioned him. Like this is almost, I think, a quality of contemporary figure sculpture that I appreciate is the sense that everything has meaning. So I want to talk about the way you use glaze to highlight specific parts of the body. So in the piece, The Seeds of Tomorrow, which was in the show in Philadelphia, you have a hand that's dipped in Malacca glaze just up to the palm or covering part of the palm. So visually, the glaze then is like pointing to this action. Can you talk about that both with fabric and with glaze, like how you create focal point to get the viewer to think something with the work?
The glazed areas are such a strong contrast to the terrace skin of the bodies. And so you have this high gloss compared to this kind of satiny sheen. And then the contrast both of color of the red clay to then the white of the glaze, as well as then the gold luster areas, really draws like attention to certain things. And so I'll be, whether it's on in that particular sculpture, and like the railroad spikes that are also there, or the produce that is in the hands. It's and meant to really be like a way to then that luminosity and of that glaze to then draw your attention and say, I want you to pay attention to the fact that they are growing this produce. This is their relationship, and this is what is then in turn feeding these kids and feeding then other people as well. And it's really meant to be like this direct one-to-one, is that the labor itself, the act of growing food and harvesting, is absolutely related to our bodies ourselves. It is the thing that maintains us. And so much of the labor in this country, so when it comes to produce, fresh produce is migrant labor. Much of that migrant labor being, of whether it be from people from Mexico or Central America altogether. There's a lot of, especially like undocumented folk who are very much integral to this foodways and processes. And so that's kind of like how I think about it in the modern day. But then also, that piece in particular was based on another one of those oral histories from the Watkins Museum of some of the families who lived in La Yarda. And that piece was like important to them because each piece of produce depicted in that sculpture was named specifically of something that they grew from themselves. They had all these like home gardens that they used to supplement their income, because the income that they were making from the Santa Fe Railroad Company was pretty meager and humble. And so they had to find other ways to supplement and have like quality food for their families. And so it was like so important for me to think about that community aspect of produce and growth and harvesting and taking care of it to then for those future generations. And then that being a metaphor for then the cultivation of like and migration that happens of peoples, to then again thinking about that cultivation and trying to have a better opportunity for then those future generations. Then like the seeds in the produce very much are mimic then the seeds of the personhood of the kid that's depicted in that sculpture.
How common is it in contemporary America to collect immigrant histories? Like, is this more common, or is this really rare to have the Watkins Museum focus on that local history in the area?
I don't know if I can speak to it on a national level quite as much, but there are even placards around town describing some of the local Lawrence history, and even there, like it is definitely the intention of the families who are part of this, who are trying to grow this history and make it more visible. And without them putting the effort to show their own history, there is like a very, very small image and a tiny little bit of text on one placard in town that you can see in a public space. And beyond that, within like the public space, like Watkins is strived to try to highlight some of this history within their museum, just because it's such a like they are just absolutely one part and an integral part of the local community there. And I don't know if it's like all over the country. I couldn't say.
Because I've talked to a few different artists that are working from immigrant histories, but I get the sense that that's all within our generation or slightly older. This is not like our grandparents' generations that have started museums that still exist today. I feel like there's almost a wave of importance that's being put on immigrant history as American history. Like, this is American history. So I'm interested in how, when you get to a place, you then start making the work.
Yeah, now that I think more about it, it's like whose immigrant history is being depicted. Because if you open up any kind of main textbook in high school, like, U.S. history, that's describing a lot of immigrant history. Even this just depends on whose history is getting shared, you know? So I guess it's really all over the U.S. It's just like depends on whether you're part of a minority or whether you're part of the majority. Of whether or not how visible some of that history is, depending on which country in which you are immigrating from.
No, that makes sense because I live in New Jersey, and a lot of the immigrant histories around here are very much related to Italy. Like I was not expecting that when I got here to be the Italian American community is well organized. There's a developed sense of food. There's all that stuff. But when you move to a new location, how do you decide, or how do you find these local histories, and then how does that actually turn into the work? So use the Seeds of Tomorrow, that piece, because I'll post an image of that as an example of this process of you moving somewhere, getting tied in, and then making work about it.
I was born in Utah, but then I moved to Indiana, and then from Indiana moved to Kansas. And in that process, I was making work about some of the Latin American history on a more of a national level, and up to that point. But then once I moved to Lawrence and started doing residencies there, I then started to dig in and search through what is the Latin American history within Lawrence. And so that was just like, starting off from like just a generalized Google search of trying to find any kind of information that's out there. And I stumbled upon this documentary, In Search of La Yarda, which is a duo of documentarians. And they created this documentary about then the families of La Yarda, who worked for the Santa Fe Railroad Company. As well as then digging into that, I kind of found then through the Watkins also some oral histories of people who already been like recording from these families, with some conservationists trying to showcase some of the, or try to really put that into the register of the museum of these histories. And so then starting to dig into that, then it's like a moment of just pure research. I always kind of start off at a point where I don't have any specific ideas. It's all about just trying to funnel in new information and be a student of history and learn initially. And then as I start to listen to things, I wait for these moments for things to click, where something like visually can be an object that then can be a symbol for a labor or a symbol of that place, as well as then something that then strikes me. So for then Seeds of Tomorrow, and listening to those oral histories, they talked about a lot of different things. They talked about, some of the good things of growing up there and some of the joys that they had, the games they played, the places they walked, the places they swam, as well as, some of the things that, weren't so great and that were difficult for them in the way they had to navigate living in Lawrence, Kansas. But within that, then I started to hear this repeated kind of echo of these local gardens being a source of flowers, beauty, of food, of community. And it was once I started hearing enough people in these different oral histories describe the same thing, then I realized that itself is one of the most important things I was taking away from it. Just because it was something that related to many people from that community, and then could become the symbol within the work of what I'll be, growing sweet potatoes or harvesting pears or tomatoes. And all these different things can then relate back to that story. And, it does become like somewhat abstracted, because without me sharing some of this information, it's like, why is this person holding a tomato and a pepper in their hands? But, if you kind of dig into it and kind of notice that connection, it's like that emotional connection and visual connection between that parent and child, and thinking about what does that mean in combination with the name of the sculpture, and how then that can be a metaphor from the plant to then the people.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Hi, I'm Kara, content creator and Facebook wrangler for Amico Brent, bringing you ideas and support for your creative adventures every day. This week's episode is brought to you by Amico Brent. Find your favorite Amico glaze at your local distributor. Happy glazing!
Today's episode is brought to you by the Rosenfeld Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. The collection exists as an online resource for research and inspiration, featuring photos of thousands of objects made by over 800 artists. The images are high quality and can be used with no permission required, making them a great resource for students and teachers. To find out more, visit rosenfieldcollection.com. So you mentioned before that one of the elements is railroad spikes, and because they worked for the Santa Fe, they look as if they're ritual adornment. Like that's the feeling. Like they're not straight, they curve up. So can you talk about, because it almost seems like it's mythic, like that this is a person that lives outside of our time and space. And ironically, it's that adornment, that railroad spikes, that's what gives that vibe. So can you talk about that? Plus, I think you use headdresses and other work. So just talk about how you use adornment to shift our perception of the figure.
I remember Malcolm, one of my former mentors from IU, really speaking and like questioning me about the sculptures I was making. And, a lot of them were very literal. Lunch lady dumping some food out on the ground out of frustration. And there was like symbolism within that, but, it was very straightforward. And I remember him like remarking like, it's sculpture, it's art. How can you amplify a part of this sculpture to better communicate your ideas? And so then the adornment is a way to then amplify a part of this person's identity. And in this case, it's kind of a multi-tiered. So the headdresses in some of these pieces are based upon then the ceramic and art history from Latin America, from the many different tribes of artwork, centuries and millennia ago. In particular, so with Seeds of Tomorrow, then my friend actually was the life casting model for that piece and for that face of the mother in the sculpture. And so then I made sure to also ask, where is your family from in Mexico? And then from that, then I researched some ceramic sculptures, and they had this kind of shape of the headdress that is now, it's different, but it has a lot of similarities to what is then shown in Seeds of Tomorrow sculpture. So that I could have that relationship of where she is, her family, and where they're from in Mexico, then relate back to the sculpture itself, just so that part of her personhood is embedded into that sculpture. And then when it comes to the railroad spike, kind of like almost necklaces or adornment that is on the sculptures, I'm big part of migration. I was born in the U.S., but my mom, having been born in Panama and migrated, there's something that is very much part of the experience of that migration, that you never have access to the things that you had before. You don't have, like, as an example of when it comes to food, you can't get a hold of the same ingredients. And so you have like this almost nostalgic desire to connect back to the tastes, the flavors, the smells that you had before, but you don't have the same ingredients. And so you have to find a way to try to recreate that with the things you have around you, even if it's not exactly the same thing. You're at least like striving for that memory. And so with the neck pieces too, then there was a lot of gold adornment, especially then also throughout then. You can see on the pieces from art history from throughout Latin America, there's a lot of adornment on those pieces, all throughout Mexico, as well as just really southbound all the way down to South America. And using then the materials that people had access to, the railroad spikes, in relationship to the fact that they lived right next to the railroad tracks and worked for the railroad company, then is like a way of like, what is around them at that time, and what can then they use, what materials to then, for beauty, for adornment, to feel something that is like, maybe it doesn't visually connect directly to a sculpture or a piece of art or a piece of culture, but it does relate back to the fact that the peoples, from the Americas were wearing these large pieces of gold and stuff. And, that's part of why there was a lot of colonization that happened, because the gold that they were wearing. And so it's like, kind of like taking like pieces of these like different histories from many places and many peoples to like realize, how are we here today? because it's all about showing people here today, here now. Even if it's like each little component and symbol is a way kind of showing the steps of what led them to the point where they are here today now.
I want to back up from your specific work and talk more about just what it is to make a career as a figure sculptor. When you make these large scale works, because they're we should mention like they're full scale human. In fact, some of them were, because the way they're displayed, are bigger. Like you're actually kind of looking up into the face of the figure. When you're making things that are both that large and that specific, and that you've taken so much time in, how do you manage as with your career showing that? So, for instance, do you want to show it like three times and then that's it? And then you wait 10 years and then you have a retrospect or like a bigger show? Like, how do you manage once you've made it, how you're going to show it?
It's that would definitely is the probably one of the biggest struggles because I love big sculpture. Love it. When I walk into museums and galleries, like honestly, like I can love small work as well, but the large pieces of sculpture that just dominate the room. Like there was this piece by Doho Su that was at the Seattle Museum of Art Museum. That is all almost like it's all made of dog tags, and it is like armor that then is almost like a cloak-like open form, like a uh, that then stretches out onto the ground in this like circular pattern. It's huge. It fills the room, and pieces like that were very striking to me because I just become so enwrapped by what's going on, the materials used, as well as the symbolism being shown because of the what it is. And so I'm drawn to that work, but it does create a very like technical challenge of like then moving the work and showing the work. I've found myself that if it's within like, I don't know, maybe like a 3 hour radius, am willing to drive the work myself. Luckily, I intentionally got a large truck to be able to move these big crates. And then if it's like for a short show, like I've been invited to be part of shows that were only a month long and asking for like a big piece. I'm just like, unless you're paying for shipping, no way. It's just like it's very physically demanding as well as it takes time to like get it into the truck and get it there and get it back down from the truck and set it up on all these crates. It's just very demanding. So I definitely have like had to learn like my own boundaries of what is like reasonable for me to do, just because it's being a figurative artist is also on top of being a technician and a teacher and a spouse and working in residencies and grants and all these things. Like I only am one person, and I wish I had like the means to just like make the work and then let somebody else take care of it and deal with it, but I'm not at that moment, so we got to make do.
What role do you think museums play in the ecosystem of figure sculptors? Because that's kind of the best place. I mean, you can tell me better, but it seems like a museum or an institution is going to be one of the better places for people to see it. If a collector buys it, unless they have a massive home, probably it's not going to be on display. It'll be like in its crate. So, do you think museums feed this ecosystem of figure sculpture, or do you see that as like that's for people that have been doing it for 40 years? Like how do you think museums fit into that?
I think you're very right in that museums are the best avenue for showing some of this work long term, because most people just don't have the space to even house something that big. And I think that pieces that large, at least for myself, they move me and make me really consider the work so much more. But then, it's not able for me to even show it in that many spaces just from just the scale of the work. I'm lucky enough to have a piece that is part of a collection now in North Carolina at the Sand Hills Community College. And, outside of that, like, I'm moving and storing these large sculptures and kind of like dependent upon museum spaces to be able to show them when they do come up. Most collectors are only going to be collecting either something that can fit like, on a shelf, something that's like more of the size of a bust, or maybe something even smaller yet, with more like the size of even just like fingers or something. So these tiny little sculptures that I also make. And, I don't know what the answer is necessarily, like on like the quantity of work that I intend to make. I've kind of found that I can only at very most make one of those large sculptures a year, just out of like time and space. But then I don't know. I think I more often than not am just so gravitated towards it that my ideas start off on those large pieces, and then sometimes I have to like narrow them down to like these smaller things just out of time constraints and space constraints and the desire to be able to ship something so I can actually be part of other shows. Because otherwise, it would really limit me if I was only fabricating these really large pieces. There's only a few shows I could even be invited to.
Yeah, I remember my graduate professor told me one time, you need to have your work for you, meaning that like it's your calling card. It needs to be able to get out there. But shipping a 7 foot tall sculpture is totally different than me shipping a box of pots.
Yeah, absolutely. It totally is. Well, and the cost is vastly different. And just even like having to get people to build crates, because sometimes I build crates, sometimes I've had institutions help support me to build those crates because they knew that they were asking for something large, and so they're like, okay, I understand, I'm asking for a lot, so we'll try to help you where we can. Yeah, I definitely think that the big pieces, that's a great description of calling card, where it's like that becomes very memorable. And then maybe that's the anchor of one show, but then all the smaller pieces are really where I'm going to be more likely to actually be able to sell pieces for collections.
Can you talk about being a technician at Kansas City Art Institute and how, like financially, how having that day job helps you then make what you want to make, or maybe it doesn't. But can you talk about like how having having that regular paycheck, how that fits into your creativity?
Yeah, now that I started this job in August at the Kansas City Art Institute as the shop technician for sculpture. And then I'm also then a lecturer for one class, a non-major for that's an elective class that people from the rest of the college can take. And in the last few years, I have been able and have been lucky enough to be able to start to sell some pieces and sell some sculptures, on kind of a range of different scales. But it the kind of work that I make is very specific, and it does include identity. It does include politics. And so for then that reason, I think it to some extent kind of limits the kind of work that people want to collect. And because they may not share the same politics that I do, they may not relate to the same kind of background that I have. And I think that there has been a push to try to include a more diverse collection within institutions' collections. But overall, still, because of the kind of work that I'm wanting to make about the people I'm making work about, honestly, often don't have the money to collect the work I'm making. And so that kind of like puts me in between a rock and hard place where then it's like, I'm going to keep making this work because it's meaningful to me. It gives me fulfillment to be able to connect with people in this way. I know that as a young person, I for many years did not see artwork in galleries or museums that reflected anything similar to my background. And then since then, I've had shows that then people who have had a more similar shared experience that I have, even if they do come from different countries and still have varied stories for their own history, they relate to it in a way that they don't normally get to see themselves in gallery and museum spaces. And that feeling that for them to feel seen, I know what it feels like for me, and it's something that I value so much that it motivates me to keep making work about these topics, even if it does maybe shrink maybe the pool of people who would be more likely to collect it. Um, and so then working this full-time job as a technician is a means for me to also not be financially reliant on selling tons and tons of sculptures to then be able to pay my bills, pay rent and pay for food. And so it does free me to then I can make about whatever topic I want to. I can make it about any history that I want to. And it's not like as much of a worry whether or not this piece sells at this show. Because I hope it still does, I'd still love for that to happen. But, it's not like it's 100% if I don't do this, then I, don't have money to pay for my phone bill or something. It is difficult, working full time is hard. It does take its toll on the amount of time I can spend in the studio. That's something that, especially since August, I've been kind of grappling with. The few years prior to that, where I've been in residencies in Lawrence, I chose the opposite route where I was working part-time and making a ton. And I really had a lot of momentum in the studio for that reason. And then it's kind of just recently flip-flopped where it's the reverse of that now, where I'm working a ton. And then, my time in the studio is really quite minimal in comparison. And so it does, like, there's always that push and pull, like what stability do you want in your life? Financial stability, health insurance, all these things that are just like very pragmatic realities, but then at the same time, then I have less worry about like, can we afford to like get something fixed on our truck? I hope I don't get sick, because I don't have any way to like go to the doctor, so it does relieve some other like problems. So it's, there's always a push and pull of where your time is and how it's spent and how much work you're able to make.
Is the technician job a 12-month a year job, or do you get like a chunk in the summer where you could make work?
Yeah, it is a 9-month contract, which I'm stoked about because I do intend on using that time to make. I imagine I'll probably have to find some part-time work a little bit just to like still have some amount of income. Or maybe I'll have some shows going on to like also probably or bring in some income or workshop or something like that. But it is my hope that I can have as much time as possible during those breaks to then focus on the work itself, on making the sculpture, because that's where my heart is. That's where I wish, I could spend more time. And, I always have more ideas than I ever have time to make. So
to wrap up, can you leave your website or social media so people could get in touch?
yeah, absolutely. It's just a JCC Sculpture on Instagram. And same thing for my website. It's just JCC, I think it's -sculpture.com.
Well, thanks so much, man. This has been a pleasure.
Well, thank you for asking me to be here, and I'm really grateful, and I hope you have a great weekend.
I'd like to thank Jonathan for coming on the show. I got to see his work for the first time last year in Philadelphia, and it was amazing to see it in person, so I'm honored that he'd come on the show. Before I go, I'd like to thank today's sponsors. That's Amico Brent, the Archie Bray Foundation, and the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. If you're interested in becoming a sponsor on the show, you can get in touch at brickyardnetwork.org. I've been working on a series about the history and impact of the Archie Bray Foundation that is upcoming, and I'm collecting stories from folks about their experiences at the Bray. If you'd like to leave a message, we have a listener call-in Bray storyline. You can find that by going to brickyardnetwork.org and click on the link at the top of the page. I'll be back next week with another episode. Thank you all for tuning in. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.
This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network. an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.